The supervisor is the person who guides a student through the PhD, who is there from beginning to end, at their side, at some distance, behind, sometimes giving a push, sometimes ahead, beckoning the student on. But it's the person who's there to be with the student and guide them through the process of the PhD.
PhD supervision is a strange relationship, I think, between the supervisor and the student, where the supervisor has in mind that they want a certain piece of work done and completed successfully, and the student wants to get a PhD which is successful. So they're both looking for success, but they perhaps have slightly different focus on how to achieve that. It's crucial for the supervisor that a project is successful, because an unsuccessful project will damage their reputation.
Come in. Rebecca, sit down. Sit down, make yourself at home.
It's Rachel.
It's what?
Sorry, it's Rachel, not Rebecca.
Is it? Oh, so it is. Well, sit down, Rachel.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry.
Not at all. Now, I've read your research proposal, of course, but why don't you tell me a little about what you've got in mind?
Well, don't know where to start, really. I would like to thank you for agreeing to be my principal supervisor. I was really excited when I got the email. Ever since I read The First Teenager, I've been sort of hoping that maybe you'd supervise my thesis, so thank you. Wow, what a great book. I feel really privileged to be working with you, but I'm also a bit nervous. I don't really know what to expect.
Your proposed title, Western Tribes, the Teenager as Exportable Construct. Interesting. What drew you to the subject?
Well, initially I just really wanted to do a PhD because it's so useful from a job point of view.
Quite, yes.
Well, typically supervision is actually done by two tutors. There's normally a first supervisor and a second supervisor. In terms of how much the second supervisor is involved, that varies enormously across institutions. So the first supervisor has primary responsibility. In some institutions, the second supervisor might, for example, take stand-in when that first supervisor is unwell or ill or on holiday, for example. In other institutions, it might be a lot more shared.
Students tend to expect the agenda to be set entirely by the supervisor, and part of the process of the first year, I think, is moving towards the students seeing themselves as taking the lead in the supervisions. So I think very often there's a need to start talking about those expectations right at the beginning and say that during the course of the first year I would expect you, the student, to increasingly take the lead in supervisions, come to the supervisions with an agenda, with issues you've been thinking about and want to raise, and for the onus to be less and less on me as the supervisor. Although of course those first few meetings I think the onus is very much on the supervisor.
In a science-type project, quite often a student is joining a research group and there are particular things that need to be done, and the supervisor might think, well, this is the person who's going to do them for me. So there can be misunderstandings about the relationship, who's in charge of the project. And of course it's a joint relationship and that needs to be negotiated quite early.
Well, I think the first meeting between the student and supervisor is a very crucial one, really, because that's the one in which both student and supervisor sort of set out what each might want from each other. So I think one of the first things it's important to establish in that meeting is the way that relationship's going to work, and neither party, I think, should take it for granted. So in a sense, setting up right to the beginning what is involved, how it's going to work, what each party is going to bring to that relationship, that supervisor relationship, is absolutely key.
Working with young people has made me want to find out more about, like youth culture and consumerism as concepts, and how important they are in terms of late capitalism and how they're exported around the world.
I see. You seem pretty certain of the idea of the teenager in the developing world and where your research is going to take you.
Yeah, I thought I'd do an empirical study with lots of interviews with young people from various backgrounds, like how they define themselves. In Samoa, perhaps, go back to Margaret Mead's original studies. How many interviews do you think it would take for a PhD?
Hang on. Before we rush off to Samoa, let's just think about how we're going to work on this. Some broad parameters would be useful before we talk about your detailed plans.
Sorry, yeah, I've been getting a bit carried away with it all.
Yes. Well, you've registered and got the postgraduate handbook and a library card, and you've been keeping an eye on the research student notice board with a list of this term's seminars.
Yeah, registration's all sorted. I've had a look through the student handbook and noted this term's seminars.
I think it's worth more than a quick look. You're starting on a long process. You'll be reading widely, going to seminars, checking on journals. This is a piece of original research. You're going to be writing a thesis of 80 to 100,000 words. Think of it like writing a book. A PhD can be a long, hard road. I took nearly 9 years on mine.
80 to 100,000 words, wow. It's quite scary when you say it out loud, isn't it? I'll never be able to write that much. It's hard enough writing my master's dissertation, and that was only 20,000, and it took ages.
It's manageable if you're really organised, but you have to remember that at times it'll feel like a long, lonely business.
It just feels like such a massive undertaking.
I'm not trying to put you off, Rachel. We wouldn't have offered you a place if we didn't think you could do it, but it's as well to be aware of the challenge.
Taking on a PhD is a big, life-changing decision. And I will always say that to students before they start the PhD at interview. Do you realise what you're taking on? This thing that you're embarking on, whether you do it full-time or part-time, will change your life. It will disrupt your relationships. You might even see some of your close, important relationships ending. I mean, that does happen. You will find your mental space taken over by it in different ways at different times, but you will have very little energy for other things at certain points in the PhD. You will become obsessive, you'll become boring to many of your old friends. You'll have your mental health severely taxed, but you'll also find, if it's the right thing for you, you'll find great joy and satisfaction in it and huge excitement. But it might well be a very lonely thing to do. And you'll find yourself becoming the expert on your very narrow field of study.
A science PhD is a job, and it's fully funded generally by some institution. It can be funded in various ways. Generally, it's not funded by the student in any respect. So someone's paying for that work. It can be funding from industry. So they're expecting results. They're expecting something to be achieved, and it needs so that some sort of seriousness about the research.
But it's different in science. I see her every day because I work in a lab with her 9 till 5. It's more like a job, really.
How'd you get on?
Sure, yeah. It's not really a question of getting on. We work together. I'm in a team with some postdocs on the same research council grant, and she's in charge. She's the grant holder, so she's the boss, really.
So, do you just do what she says?
Not always. I do sometimes get to say what I think. I can suggest an alternative hypothesis. She seems happy enough with that, within reason. But if it means having to get new or different equipment and supplies, it's usually out of the question. There's this one really quiet guy who never opens his mouth. I think she finds that a bit dull. You know, he's just happy to be in a lab. Just does the experiments and goes home when it's finished. Doesn't say much, doesn't contribute much. Never speaks in the Friday lab meetings.
We often disagree.
Well, that's social science for you, isn't it? No clear questions, no controlled trials, and so no proper answers.
Watch it, you. You scientists just don't get it, do you? I will be doing a literature review, you know.
In a proper subject, your supervisor defines a research question in advance, and there are strict rules of procedure that you have to follow. A defined methodology, detailed notes of your observations, statistical test of your results.
Oh, sounds so stimulating. Another coffee, Einstein?
Why, thank you. And relatively sharpish, if you don't mind.
Oh, ha ha.
We're going to be working together for at least 3 years, so we need to make sure, not just that we get on together, but that we're properly organised. Now, I think it's a good idea to begin with that you look at somebody else's thesis so you can see how much work you have to do and also its limitations. Here's a recent one I supervised on goths. Black on the inside. But the first task, as far as your own work goes, is to start producing a bibliography. and that means finding and identifying key texts by trawling through relevant bodies of literature. Then, after that, you'll do a review of that literature, and then we'll have your first written work. So, take this away with you.
Whew, weighs a ton. OK, I'll have a look at that this week. Do you want me to bring my bibliography to the meeting on Monday? Or?
No. What we really need to work on is a timetable over the course of a year. So I thought we could agree to meet in maybe 6 weeks' time.
Oh.
No, we could leave it longer.
Well, I was hoping that we can meet a bit more often. The handbook says that...
Well, we'll probably bump into each other. I'm often in the department. You know, the way I like to work is to meet every 6 weeks. I have a lot of work of my own and they've given me a rather heavy teaching load this term. But you can always email me in the event of a problem or if there's any urgent questions you want to discuss.
Oh, I'm exhausted. I haven't been out for months. I'm going to see him again next week about that chapter I was up all night with. Can't seem to get it right.
Next week? I haven't seen mine for nearly 2 months.
How come?
Well, we had a first meeting which was really helpful. She gave me lots of references to read. But since then, she's been away, being important, attending meetings and conferences abroad. The research log they had me draw up at the induction workshop turns out to be a complete work of fiction.
Oh, that's not good. You should call her or email her or something.
But she's so busy when she is here. Apparently she's had to take over some new MA course and she's post-grad tutor for the year.
Call her.
I can't do that. It's not that easy. Behind that big solid door, always busy. At home, you just don't knock on doors like that. It's a bit intimidating, you know. Sometimes I go to knock, walk up and down for a while thinking about it, then run off.
But Neat, it's your PhD. You need some support. It is her job. Besides, your fees are helping to pay her wages. The handbook says in the first term you should see your supervisor every fortnight.
I really don't want to be difficult. She told me I should be independent and not keep bringing every little problem to her. So I just thought, right girl, keep your head down and get on with it. Look, if worst comes to the worst and I fail, I can always appeal. I'll just explain that she was never available and that wasn't my fault.
You can't do that.
Why not?
Didn't you see in the handbook? The rules are that lack of supervision is not grounds for appeal. If there's a problem, you have to sort it out now. I reckon you should email her, ask her for a meeting. If you don't hear back, just call her. Keep calling until she answers. No, I'm being serious. It's important. Promise me you will?
Okay, I'll send her an email next week. But I really don't want to bother her when she's so busy on more important things.
Well, get bothering, girl. And don't forget about your second supervisor. That's what we're there for.
Many overseas students have very little idea about how a British PhD works. And some come from backgrounds where they have maybe gone through to quite high levels in the educational system elsewhere, where they have been much more in a subservient role and have been told what to do at each step and achieve those targets. Whereas here they can come and sometimes they seem to be left to their own devices rather too much.
I don't know about 6 weeks. I mean, would it be possible to say we'll meet once every month? I mean, I think I feel happier with that. It would just really help with my planning and just making sure I'm going about it okay.
Well, if you really think you need that level of support, most of my students like a less rigid system.
Well, it's not so much support, it's more just making sure I'm on track with it all. Of course, I will email you stuff, but I just really like to feel we had a regular pattern of meetings in place, at least to start with.
I'm really very busy at the moment. A visit to China next week, plus my publisher's deadlines to meet. I'm not sure I can guarantee a regular monthly meeting. Which reminds me, Rachel, there's 1 or 2 things I want to ask you to do next week while I'm away.
I've heard of cases of PhD supervisors asking their students to go and pick up their dry cleaning or to give them a lift home, or to come and help them redecorate, and sometimes explicitly and sometimes just sort of intimating the suggestion so the students felt that that was what was expected. I don't think that's appropriate. I mean, I tend to think it's important to keep quite clear boundaries and not expect your students to work for you. I think the expectation or the possibility of some teaching work is something that is very often to the student's advantage. I mean, it's good to get experience of teaching whilst you're doing a PhD, but that should be teaching that the student is being paid for, not as again, sometimes one hears PhD students being expected to take classes for their supervisors because their supervisors are too busy or want to do something else more interesting.
Professor Harris emailed me. She wants to know if I'm interested in doing some teaching.
Hey, that's great. That'll be such a good experience for when you get back home.
Yep, she's on research leave this term to finish her book, and she says I can take over a couple of her first-year seminars. There's a bit of money involved, so that's good for me, but it is quite a lot of work. I've never done any teaching before, and I told her, but she said I could check on some tutor training courses and review the course notes and textbook.
Sounds like a lot. That's quite a responsibility. Have you got time for all of that?
I'm not sure, but I really don't think I can say no.
Would it be okay with you if I contact you towards the end of each month to sort out a time that we can both make? Would that be okay?
Yes, but you better contact me, otherwise I'll forget.
Yeah, I will. I'll just make a note of that, actually. Oh, you don't mind if I make notes in our meetings, do you? Just so I remember everything you've said. I could send you a copy if you like.
Well, I think that's a good idea anyway. I might say something brilliant at any moment. It's good to keep a record of what's been discussed, and then we know what to expect next time.
I also think it's really important that we have written records of what happens in supervision meetings, by which I don't mean a verbatim transcript, I mean minutes of the meeting. And my practice, and I think this is good practice, is to get the student to minute the meeting, to take brief notes during the meeting and to take time in the meeting to make notes. So rather than letting it sort of swim by in the sort of pleasure of a conversation, to stop at times and say, I need to make a note of that. And then for the student to send the minutes of the meeting to me and to the other supervisor, and I usually stress within 24 hours because I want to get the student to write the notes when it's fresh in their mind.
Some supervisors and indeed some students like a certain kind of style, which might be very regular meetings, perhaps weekly, perhaps every 2 weeks, where there's an agenda, where there's a very, very clear structure, and that structure remains intact for the entire duration of the PhD. Other supervisors and indeed other students prefer something a bit more ad hoc, a bit more arranged when and as the supervision is required. So there's actually quite a variations of style. And I think in order for it to work, I think it has to be a style and approach that works for both student and the supervisor. So the key thing is, I think, to negotiate that from the start, but also I think be very aware that what is required is very likely to change throughout the course of the PhD. So what's the style of meetings, the frequency of them at the start may be very different from the style and frequency of meetings and other support that goes on, for example, towards the end.
I see from your proposal you've already done some reading in the field. I find with most PhD students it's helpful to consider writing a short paper after a few months. You can present it to the departmental graduate seminar, just a 10-minute talk on your topic. That way you can focus your own ideas and we'll get a clearer idea about what fresh ground you've covered since you've been here and where you can take it from there.
So present it, you mean read it out?
Yes, Rachel, read it out. And that way your writing can improve and you'll get other people's opinions.
Well, yeah, but it's your opinion that counts in the end.
That's very flattering, Rachel. But you have to remember, you'll be examined in your viva at the end of the process by 2 independent examiners. That's not me. I'm not your examiner. What you'll get from me is just guidance, hopefully of the helpful sort.
So, did she like your chapter?
Yeah, I think so. I don't know, really.
Eh?
Well, she said it was great. It was brilliant, right? But there was no detail, no specific comments or anything.
Did you ask?
Not really. She just said there was nothing to worry about apart from a few spelling mistakes, and I should carry on. So I am.
Mate, if you want detailed feedback, ask for it.
Well, do you?
I don't need to. I get plenty. Too much sometimes. Checks up on my notes all the time, you know? Make sure I'm not getting ahead of myself. Now, Will, I don't want you wandering off doing your own thing. Sometimes I wonder if I'm ever actually going to get a PhD at all.
Yeah, we should swap supervisors.
I think students can really expect a very high standard and a detailed level of feedback. It's one of the most important things supervisors can do in the whole supervisory relationship. One thing that helps a lot, though, is for the student to make it very clear what kind of feedback they're looking for. There's many instances, for example, where students hand in pieces of work, and what they're looking for is really a general sense of, does the argument make sense is this hanging together or not as a piece of work? And sometimes the supervisor can feel duty-bound to point out typos, spelling mistakes, style problems, when that's not really the issue. So I think if a student is giving a supervisor a piece of work, it's very important to make it clear what it is about, what kind of feedback they want.
If a student feels they're not getting helpful feedback, then they should raise that with their supervisor as soon as possible. I mean, it really is the student's responsibility to take charge of the relationship and to tell the supervisor if they don't think the feedback is good. Now that can be very difficult. It's always difficult to challenge someone about their failings in any relationship, and it's especially difficult between a student and a supervisor. The power relationship makes that difficult.
So even if you like my work, I might fail the Viva.
It's possible, but my record's quite good in that respect.
But how am I supposed to know if I'm going about it all okay and if I'm on the right track?
How does anyone know? For a start, you'll get comments from me. Then you'll show your work to other people, talk to them about it. You're not the only PhD student here, you know. Remember, you're part of an academic community now. Take the upgrade and review process seriously, and in due course we'll submit something for publication. Even if they turn it down, you'll get some very helpful feedback. It's good to know what the experts in your field think about your work. Meanwhile, remember about the conferences and the possibility of giving papers. It's your responsibility to look out for those opportunities. And then I'll look out for things that I might hear that might be of interest.
What happens in the upgrade process is that students move from being registered from an MPhil to a PhD. And this is a process that can seem quite strange, I think, to a lot of students because they feel, well, haven't I kind of registered for a PhD and I'm doing a PhD? The answer is in most institutions you haven't. You registered for an MPhil to begin with. Now this can seem like, I guess, a sort of strange process to go through, but it's quite useful both for the student, I think, and for the university or the institution. What that process is about is actually making sure that the work the student's been doing is of sufficient quantity and quality and, I guess, shape and size that will eventually be the right kind of format for a PhD and for that PhD thesis to be successful.
Being a PhD student is a whole life, really. I mean, it's not just the meetings with the supervisor, it's not just sitting in the library, it's not just writing, although all those things are important. It's about becoming an academic. It's a training for a particular career for many students. It's about going to conferences, it's about networking with people working in the same area, making contacts with one's peers, with other PhD students around the country and internationally. Those contacts will be the basis of a student's future network. I mean, people I met when I was doing my PhD are now my colleagues. They're spread around the country, they work abroad. They become very important. Those friendships that you make become the sort of sustaining friendships and collegial relationships that keep you going through 30, 40 years.
I think one of the hardest things about doing a PhD is both giving and receiving criticism. I think in order for a PhD to be successful and it to work, it really is quite a long exercise in being critical, both about yourself, your abilities, your thinking, but also about other people's work. And I think really, if as an individual you find it very difficult to take criticism, then probably doing a PhD isn't a good idea. I think you have to kind of get used to it.
Hey, how was the conference?
Don't ask.
Why, what happened?
Well, I was having a great time. It was really stimulating and I felt like I was really part of something. You know how isolating it can get sometimes, like staring out the window over a sleeping laptop, reading and reading and reading.
Stop it, don't.
So there I was in the bar, on a bit of a high. This bloody prof comes up to me, asks me loads of questions about my work, tells me I'm wasting my time.
What?
Yeah, I told him about my thesis. He reckoned it had been done before and I'm wasting my time.
Did he go into detail?
Oh, he just said I was barking up the wrong tree. Teenagers are so 1990s. I didn't really know what to say. Just went and hid in my room, burst into tears. It all seemed a bit pointless, And I phoned home and told them I might as well just give up now.
Professor Beard warned me about this sort of thing before I went up to do my postgrad thing last month at Birmingham. You should ask the guy for details. Email him and tell him how fascinated you were by the conversation and how a couple of references would be really useful. Then you'll know.
It's all a bit scary, this conference business.
You aren't an undergraduate now, Now, there are people and ideas to look out for in conferences, of course, You can contact people in your own field, contact some by email. Most people will be happy to help if you ask about their work. In a little while, you will be the leading expert on your particular topic. You'll know more about this subject than anybody else, including me.
When you said we might publish something, did you mean together?
Possibly. There are different traditions in different subjects. My preference is to leave the student as the author of the piece and acknowledge whatever part I may have played in it, if any. But we needn't worry about that now, okay? Now, I imagine you want to finish in 3 years. All being well, there's no reason you shouldn't finish within that time, but some people take 4 years. We don't want you scribbling indefinitely, do we? You'll run out of money and patience and friends.
One area that sometimes isn't explored in terms of science PhD supervision is how are the results going to be reported? They will be reported in scientific papers, but who are going to be the authors? Is the student going to be the only author? That's very, very unlikely. Normally the supervisor will be a co-author. Is the supervisor going to be the first author or the second author? Are everyone else in the group going to be on the paper as well, listed because they've helped in some way? So that needs to be talked about too, because that can be another area of conflict and disappointment when the student seems, oh, I've done all this work and my name's 6th on the list of names at the head of this paper, the paper when it's published.
People inevitably have often quite unrealistic expectations of how much they'll write, for example, how much data they'll collect if they're doing a piece of empirical work, how quickly it will be done, and how clear the results will be, for example. So I think a lot of the disappointments are around speed and rate of progress. I think there's also another kind of disappointment is that people kind of go through a honeymoon period at the beginning of their PhD when they quite often feel that what their thesis will do is somehow change the world or change the world of their research they're working in. What they soon come to realise is it will make a contribution, but it's often much, much smaller and perhaps a bit more boring than they initially thought. It isn't ultimately, but people start off with very big ideas about what they want to contribute, and that's kind of toned down in a way.
Things can go wrong very easily with a PhD project, and in science it's quite difficult to get data sometimes, good quality data. It's often said that you spend the first year of your PhD working very, very hard and then throw away all the data because it's of no value whatsoever. You've learned something though, you've learned what is good data. So it's a good time, it's a useful time. I know I spent 4 months of my PhD when I started working at a microscope, Monday to Friday, 9 o'clock till 6 o'clock, and I was looking for chromosomes and I didn't see any.
Really bizarre photo in here. It's Hey, what's up? Oh, have you released a deadly microorganism into the water supply?
Huh?
What is it?
That's nothing.
Price of kebabs rocketed?
Funny.
Well, tell us.
It's nothing, sometimes I feel like I'm wasting my time.
How do you mean?
Nothing works, Just about every time I set up an experiment, it doesn't work. To begin with, I thought we'd be getting breakthroughs all the time, but I realised quite quickly that wasn't realistic. But honestly, it's depressing. I just don't feel like I'm getting anywhere at all.
Well, yeah, but did you really expect to be yelling Eureka on a daily basis?
Of course not. Well, a bit.
Have you spoken to anyone, like anyone in your team or your supervisor?
He can't talk to Professor Clementi about experiments failing, can he?
Well, why not? Okay, my flatmate's friend, biochemist, she says his postdoc got his PhD based on failed experiments. He just had to explain why they failed.
But wouldn't it look disrespectful?
Well, they expect a bit of self-sufficiency, If you've got a problem, you've got to take it to them.
I think we're so lucky to be here, we shouldn't complain.
Yeah, well, it's not complaining to raise an issue, it's all part of learning, part of the PhD process. Honestly, Anita, you've got to make them understand.
It's just polite.
Well, it looks weedy. I reckon it shows you're committed and interested if you talk about things, question things, and keep questioning.
It's easy for you. I can't risk it. It took me absolutely ages to persuade my parents that this was a good idea. I can't imagine their faces if I fail after all the sacrifices they've made.
Yeah, well, it's actually not easy for me. Do you remember that time months ago when I got completely stuck? I couldn't write a thing. It took me weeks to pluck up the courage to tell Professor Alton. I wish I'd done it immediately. I should have realised how much experience he'd have had over the years. I'm hardly the first student he's ever come across with writer's block. He was really helpful, actually. But I had to tell him, otherwise how's he going to know there's a problem? Could have gone on festering and festering, like with Will.
What do you mean? Who's festering? I'm not festering.
All I mean is that you should talk to someone. If these disappointments are getting you down, then you need to tell someone. Talk to someone in your team, and definitely your supervisor. I mean, do you really think that you're the first? Do you think she'll never have come across this before? And who's your second supervisor?
But how do you admit to a distinguished professor that your experiments aren't working?
Do you think she'd rather have a PhD student who was concerned, raised an issue, or a sad, gloomy, silent figure eaten away by disappointment, fading gradually to a pale shadow of his former self?
Right, I'll go and see her.
Good, that's you sorted. Now, Anita, we need to work on your assertiveness.
Do we?
We do.
Sometimes has happened, and I've known it with some of my students, that they become completely obsessed about their project and they start off as if it's a sprint. It's actually a marathon, and they're allowed to pace themselves. They're allowed to have time off, and they should make sure that they get that time off. At worst, then at the end, what can happen is when the thesis is being written, it becomes just too much of a thing for the student to cope with, and then the thing can disintegrate and can be very difficult to manage because they haven't relaxed into it, enjoyed it enough. The student must enjoy their project. If they're not enjoying it, they shouldn't be doing it.
3 years seems a long way to look ahead, but then again, I know how quickly my masters went.
Yes, I think you'll be surprised how quickly it passes. Everyone thinks it's plenty of time to begin with, but then the work expands, paths branch off, and before you know it, 3 years are up. The clock struck midnight and you turned into a pumpkin.
I won't be an MPhil student forever, will I? I will upgrade to PhD.
Most probably. There'll be an upgrade committee and we'll have a discussion about that in a year's time. In the meantime, take that thesis away, get some reading done, and I'll see you in 6 weeks or so.
Oh, a month?
What?
We said once a month.
Quite. Goodbye, Rebecca. Rachel.